My name is Isabella. If you passed me on the street, you might not look twice. I drive an old silver SUV, wear simple sweaters, and live in a quiet suburb where the biggest excitement is a new bakery opening down the road. No one would guess that behind the soft smiles and modest life, I run a multi-million-dollar business, a jewelry appraisal company specializing in rare antiques and hidden treasures forgotten by time. I never intended to keep it a secret. I just learned somewhere along the way that success doesn't need applause to be real. It was easier to let people believe I lived a small life, invisible but steady, especially my family. For years, I showed up at every Sunday dinner listening to my parents brag about my younger sister Emily's newest adventures, her third major, her latest business idea, her expensive tastes, funded quietly by family support. They thought I was still struggling, patching together a living from odd jobs, too stubborn to ask for help, and I let them think that. It was easier than explaining how lonely success can feel when no one wants to see you for who you really are. But last Thanksgiving, everything changed. A single careless moment, a borrowed laptop, a glimpse into a hidden world I had spent years building in silence. And suddenly, my $12.6 million empire wasn't invisible anymore. It was laid bare, right there between the turkey and the mashed potatoes. And with it came demands, accusations, and a bitter realization. Sometimes the people you love most are the ones who expect the most and appreciate the least. That Thanksgiving didn't just expose my wealth, it exposed the truth I'd been avoiding for far too long. I grew up in a small town in Vermont, the kind of place where everyone knew each other's middle names and the seasons wrote the rhythm of life. Winters were long and silent, blanketing the town in soft snow. Summers were golden, filled with the scent of wildflowers and the buzz of cicadas in the tall grass. My early years were simple and full of warmth. My father, a high school history teacher, would take me fishing on misty Saturday mornings. My mother, a part-time librarian, loved baking blueberry pies that made the whole house smell like sunshine. We weren't wealthy, but I never felt like I lacked anything important. On warm evenings, we would sit on the porch together, counting the stars and making up stories about them. For a long time, I believed I had the kind of family you read about in storybooks. Everything changed when Emily was born. She came into the world earlier than expected, a fragile little thing with tiny fists and a desperate will to live. The hospital stay was long, the fear constant. When she finally came home, it was like bringing a storm inside our small, quiet house. The rules changed overnight. Hand sanitizer bottles appeared in every corner. The windows stayed closed even on the freshest spring days. Our once cozy home turned into a sterilized fortress. I was only 7 at the time, old enough to understand that the world wasn't about me anymore. Whenever I coughed or sniffled, my mother would pack my things and send me to stay with my grandparents for Emily's safety. At first, I loved it. Grandma made the best apple crumble and always saved a soft quilt for me. But as the visits grew longer and more frequent, I started to see the truth. I was no longer essential. I was a guest in my own home. One afternoon, I brought home a drawing I was proud of, a careful sketch of the lake at sunset, crayon colours blending together just right. I ran into the kitchen, waving it in the air, eager for my mother's smile. She glanced at it for half a second before turning away, fussing over Emily's slight fever. "That's nice, honey," she murmured distractedly, reaching for a thermometer. I stood there, clutching the drawing until the paper crumpled in my hands. It was the first time I felt the sting of being invisible. It wouldn't be the last. As the years passed, the pattern deepened. Every award I won, every science fair ribbon, every book report I aced, all were met with polite nods or distracted murmurs. Meanwhile, Emily's every cough, every ballet recital, every art project was celebrated with cake, balloons, and hours of home videos. At school, teachers praised me for being so independent and so mature for my age. At home, independence became a lonely shield. No one asked where I had been when I stayed late for study groups. No one noticed when I started working part-time at the local bakery after school. As long as I stayed quiet, stayed invisible, everything was fine. Sometimes, I would sit by the attic window, watching the stars alone, remembering the nights when my father pointed out constellations just for me. I told myself that if I worked hard enough, if I became good enough, maybe they would see me again. But deep down, a small, stubborn part of me knew I could win every trophy in the world, and it still wouldn't be enough. In my parents' eyes, there was only one fragile, perfect star worth protecting, and it wasn't me. At 13, while most of my classmates were busy with dance recitals and soccer practice, I tied my hair back, buttoned up a crisp apron, and started working at a little bakery called Sweet Haven. Mrs. Lorraine, the owner, was a kind woman with silver hair, always pulled into a loose bun, and a laugh that made the wooden beams of the shop seem to glow. She didn't ask why a girl my age wanted to mop floors and wash dishes after school. She just looked at me once, nodded, and said, "Hard work deserves a place in this world." At Sweet Haven, I learned more than how to knead dough or stack pies. I learned how to show up, even when no one was watching, even when no one seemed to care. Every spare moment was spent studying at a corner table, my textbooks stained faintly with the scent of cinnamon and sugar. At home, no one asked where I went after school or why I smelled like yeast and powdered sugar. As long as I kept quiet and out of Emily's way, that was all that mattered. But in that tiny bakery, I found something precious, a quiet kind of pride, a sense that maybe, just maybe, I could build a life of my own, even if no one else believed in me. By the time I reached my senior year of high school, I'd saved every tip, every extra dollar tucked carefully away in an old tin box under my bed. Late one rainy afternoon, as I wiped down tables, my phone buzzed with an email notification. Northwood University, my dream school. Full ride scholarship. Art history major. I stood frozen. The warm scent of fresh scones filling the air, tears welling up in my eyes. Mrs. Lorraine noticed immediately. She wiped her hands on her apron, came over, and simply wrapped me in a hug. No words, just pride. The kind I had been chasing for years. That night, I showed my mother the acceptance letter, my voice trembling with excitement. She glanced at it once, muttered a soft, "That's good, sweetie," and turned back to helping Emily with her science project. No party, no congratulations, no family dinner. I folded the letter neatly and slipped it into my backpack. It would be my secret victory. College wasn't easy. Even with a scholarship, I still worked 2 part-time jobs. Shelving books at the university library and cleaning antique shops on weekends. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't Instagram-worthy. But it was mine. In my second year, I stumbled into a work-study program assisting at a small jewelry appraisal firm. Most interns wanted flashier placements, art galleries, auction houses, but I was drawn to the quiet beauty of forgotten things. At first, I spent hours cataloguing dusty rings, cracked brooches, chipped bracelets, pieces dismissed as junk. But as I studied them, I began to notice tiny details others overlooked. The fine hand engraving inside a tarnished locket, the almost invisible hallmark on the clasp of a broken necklace, the subtle weight of real silver compared to cheap plating. One evening, while cleaning a battered brooch, something clicked. Underneath the layers of grime, the craftsmanship was exquisite. Delicate filigree work, a hidden maker's mark, signs of a master artisan long forgotten by time. I stayed late that night, cross-referencing old books, museum records, anything I could find, and I discovered that the brooch wasn't just real. It was rare, crafted by a Parisian jeweler who had created pieces for nobility before the Great War. The piece, once valued at $20, was now worth over $12,000. When I presented my findings to my supervisor, she blinked in shock. Then she smiled, a slow, genuine smile, and said, "You have an eye, Isabella. A rare one." That moment changed everything. More and more pieces deemed worthless began landing quietly on my desk. I treated each one with reverence, as if uncovering the stories they had been waiting years to tell. In a way, Those forgotten jewels mirrored my own life, dismissed, overlooked, but still quietly holding value, waiting for the right hands to reveal their worth. Through every scratched band and tarnished pin, I wasn't just learning about gemstones and history. I was learning about myself. I wasn't invisible because I lacked value. I was invisible because no one had taken the time to see what was truly there. But now, I could see it for myself, and that made all the difference. That year, I offered to host Thanksgiving. It wasn't because I wanted to impress anyone. It wasn't even because I felt particularly generous. It was because I was tired. Tired of rubbery turkey, lumpy mashed potatoes, and conversations that left me feeling smaller by the minute. I wanted, just once, to create something beautiful. Quietly, I hired a catering service I had worked with during some of my company's private events. They specialized in crafting meals that were works of art, dishes plated like paintings, desserts so delicate they looked almost too pretty to eat. But I didn't tell anyone. To my family, it would simply seem like I had found a few friends from work, willing to help out. I wore a soft beige sweater and simple earrings that day, blending into the background as I always did. The house filled with the smell of rosemary, roasted vegetables, and fresh bread. 20 relatives packed into the living room, laughing and nibbling at appetizers on porcelain trays. Emily arrived late, of course, making a grand entrance with her new boyfriend. A flashy young man in designer sneakers. She breezed in, kissed the air next to my cheek, and muttered just loud enough for Mum to hear. "Looks like Isabella's trying a little too hard this year." I smiled tightly and went back to pouring wine. Dinner was a success. At least, until Emily decided she was bored. While I was upstairs checking on the dessert preparations, she wandered into my office. She claimed later that she was just looking for a phone charger. Instead, she found my laptop, still open, still logged into the live dashboard I had been reviewing before guests arrived. Bank accounts, contract balances, internal quarterly reports, all in plain sight. When I came downstairs, Emily was already parading the laptop into the dining room. "Hey everyone," she called out, her voice sugar-sweet but sharp enough to cut. "Guess what our little Isabella has been hiding?" The screen glowed under the chandelier. A stark, cold display of numbers. $12,600,000 in active assets. Pending contracts worth nearly $500,000 more. Company earnings that dwarfed anything my family had ever imagined. The room fell dead silent. Even the children stopped fidgeting. For a long, agonizing moment, all anyone could hear was the faint clink of a fork dropping onto a plate. Mum was the first to speak, forcing a shaky laugh. "Oh, come now, this must be a mistake," she said, glancing desperately between the laptop and me. "Isabella's probably just helping someone else with paperwork, right?" I stood still, the weight of a decade pressing against my chest. I could have lied. I could have laughed it off. But something inside me, something long buried, rose to the surface. "No," I said clearly, my voice cutting through the heavy air. "It's all mine. I built it." Aunt Marie gasped. Uncle David leaned back in his chair, mouth slightly open. Dad's face turned an alarming shade of red. Emily gaped at me like I had grown a second head. "You have that kind of money and you didn't tell us?" Her voice cracked halfway between anger and disbelief. "You knew Mom and Dad were struggling. You knew about my tuition and you just sat there?" I looked at her, at all of them. The people who had overlooked me, belittled me, dismissed me for so many years. "I've been sending money every month," I said quietly, turning to my parents. $7,000 for over 2 years, for bills, for tuition, for everything. Mum's mouth opened, then closed again. Dad stared at the floor. Emily's face twisted, a mixture of betrayal and rage. "You should have done more," she hissed. "Family shares everything." I felt something inside me snap, not in anger, but in clarity. "No," I said. "Family supports each other. Family values each other." I looked around the table, at the greedy, expectant faces, at the people who had only ever seen me as a quiet shadow. You didn't want to know me when you thought I was struggling. You only care now because you see dollar signs. Silence, thicker than gravy, heavier than pie crust, settled over the room. Then Mum spoke, her voice low and trembling. We're your family, Isabella. You owe us. I shook my head slowly. I owe myself. For every lonely birthday, every silent achievement, every time I was invisible in this house. I picked up the laptop from the table, closing it with a soft but decisive click. Emily lunged forward, her voice shrill. You can't just walk away. You're selfish. I turned to her, feeling oddly calm. I'm done, I said simply. Without another word, I walked toward the door. Behind me, I heard chairs scraping, voices rising in outrage, someone shouting something about duty and blood ties. But I kept walking. For the first time in my life, I wasn't running away. I was walking towards something better, myself. The morning after Thanksgiving, I sat at my kitchen table, the soft click of my laptop the only sound in the room. It took less than 5 minutes to cancel the automatic monthly transfers I had been sending to my parents. $7,000 a month, gone with a few keystrokes. For a moment, my hands trembled. Not with fear, with relief. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about anger. It was about finally letting go of a weight I had carried for too long. The fallout was immediate. My phone buzzed non-stop. Angry texts from my mother, guilt-laden voicemails from my father, tearful accusations from Emily. You're abandoning your family, one message read. After everything we've done for you, said another. Even distant relatives chimed in, some of whom I hadn't heard from in years. Cousins, uncles, people who once called me the quiet one at family reunions, now suddenly remembered my existence and my bank account. One afternoon, a former client discreetly mentioned that he had heard some unflattering things about me through the grapevine. Whispered rumors that I had become cold, selfish, ungrateful. I expected the anger. I even expected the betrayal. What surprised me was how little it hurt. I realized I had spent most of my life trying to earn love by being useful, invisible, agreeable. But love built on obligation isn't love at all. And I was finally ready to stop chasing it. Instead, I turned my focus inward. I expanded my company, opening a new office in Denver and hiring 2 brilliant young appraisers who shared my passion for forgotten treasures. We won contracts with private collectors, regional museums, even an international auction house. Each project felt like another stone laid down on a road I was building for myself. Strong, steady, mine. I bought a modest lakeside home outside Madison, not flashy, not showy. A place filled with books, warm light, and wide windows overlooking the water. I filled it with pieces that meant something. A vintage mahogany bookshelf from a closing library. A framed map of the night sky from the day I left for college. A small, worn brooch shaped like a swan, tucked into a velvet-lined box. The very first piece I had ever truly seen, for what it was. In the quiet mornings, I would sit by the window, sip black tea, and watch the mist roll across the lake. There was no applause, no stage, no audience, just peace. It wasn't just my business that grew. It was me. I stopped shrinking to fit into spaces that were never built for me. I stopped dimming my own light to make others comfortable. And the people who truly mattered, the few real friends, loyal clients, my old mentor, Mrs. Lorraine, they didn't need my wealth to love me. They loved the person I had fought so hard to become. One evening, as I organized a new jewelry exhibit, my assistant brought me a small box that had just arrived from a former client. Inside was a delicate handwritten note. To Isabella, for the woman who sees hidden treasures not only in jewels but in herself. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the words sink in. For so long, I had believed that worth was something you had to prove, something you had to shout for, cry for, beg for. But true worth is quiet. It doesn't need permission. It doesn't need validation. It just is. I thought about the life I had left behind. The strained dinners, the empty smiles, the desperate need to be enough. And I knew I had chosen right. I wasn't a ghost anymore. I wasn't a shadow. I was a light. And this time, no one could put it out but me. In the quiet that followed, Isabella found a truth deeper than any applause or validation could offer. She realized that self-worth isn't something handed to you by others. It isn't measured by how loudly people cheer for you or how many notice your success. True worth comes from within, from knowing who you are, even when the world refuses to see you. She also understood something harder, something heavier. Family isn't always the people who love you the right way. Sometimes family are simply the people you're born to. And love, real love, is something that must be chosen, nurtured, and given freely, not demanded out of duty. Choosing herself didn't make Isabella selfish. It made her strong. It made her whole. Walking away from those who only loved her when it was convenient wasn't a betrayal. It was an act of survival. An act of becoming. For the first time, she stood firmly in her own light, not asking permission, not seeking approval, not apologizing for existing. Isabella didn't need her family to see her anymore. She saw herself. And that was more than enough.